Hello, film students. I have two lectures that I want to set up for you to help you understand a little bit more about what you will be reading when it comes to Daniel Dayan. The first thing we need to do is to go over a little bit of psychology. Yay, psychology. You may have had a psychology class already. You may have had a class where you spoke about Sigmund Freud, and you may have laughed about Freud. That's perfectly fine. You should feel comfortable laughing about Freud in a psychology class. In film studies, literature studies, Freud and another psychologist by the name of Lacan, a Frenchman, they are both very, very important to the entire project of film when it comes to both creation and interpretation. So I need to give you a little bit of background about how film scholars and how film theorists and how film makers borrow from these traditions and borrow from this literature. And that will set us up a little bit for getting into Daniel Dayan, which is sort of the purpose of me recording these. So the first thing to realize is that film and psychology are deeply linked to each other historically. Sigmund Freud begins his publications at the turn of the 20th century, right around 1900. 1905 is where he releases one of his great works about human sexuality. And right around that time, early filmmaking is beginning. So you're going to get the first narrative films in the latter part of the 1910s, and then it just ramps up from there. So so there seems to be a natural kind of connection between the two. The other component of this is that film is all about perception, and a lot of your understanding of a movie actually happens through the process of perception. Obviously, you look at the film, but through the process of putting together images into a narrative. And that is a seemingly psychological act. And so it opens up the door to understanding film through the lens of psychology. Some assumptions about this as we work our way through. One is that we perceive the world through a filter. Our eyes, our nerves, those are already filters. Of course, we know that our eyes can be tricked. We know that something can go wrong, or there could be variations in nerves, things like that. But the nerves also communicate a signal to your brain. And your brain is what does the perceiving per se. And it is in there, of course, where psychology plays a hand. But what this also allows us to talk about is the fact that perception is more than just the mechanical act of perceiving something. Perception is the discourse around perceiving something and coming to understand what that something is and how it has meaning. So that process happens through your mind putting together things, your brain putting together things. But that process inside of there is, of course, influenced by your expectations, by stereotypes, by different experiences you have had, but also by traditions, by legal systems, whatever the case may be. That becomes a part of the interpretation of an event, which is part of the perception process itself. Time dilation is part of that. So time dilation is not a science fiction thing. It happens every single time you sit down and you watch a television show or a movie. You can think of it as a narrative act. So we have no problem when we watch 5 minutes of television show and then all of a sudden it's 24 hours later in the little television land or in movie land or whatever the case may be. We accept that. But there's also time dilation in how we perceive time while we are engaged in watching a movie. So, for example, any of you who have been in my class know that my go-to is normally Transformers, but Marvel movies work great for this too. For some people, one of the Marvel epics like Endgame or something is an hour and a half, feels like it's an hour and a half. It goes by so quickly. For others who suffer through those films, like me, it seems like you've spent the half of your life watching this movie. All of that is part of this time dilation as well, and it is facetious, right? It's a comedy thing, but it's also a real thing. I mean, how many times have you looked down at your watch when you've been watching something and realized that it's not the time that you thought it was? That's because of the time dilation of perception. We are not mechanical. Your memories influence this. So your memories of other movies are used by contemporary filmmakers when they make quotes of them, when they refer to them in dialogue, when they slip in references to characters from previous films. All of that is obviously related to your memory, but also your childhood memories, your own personal trauma. All of that becomes a part of the act of perception. So our perception is psychological and is therefore influenced by the psychological. Those things are also, I should say, involve ideology, they involve memory, as I mentioned, they involve traditions, they involve expectations, they involve concepts, they involve stereotypes, they involve racial ideologies, they involve sexual ideologies or gender ideologies or ideas about gender or ideas about a good person. All of those are part of the act of perception. So narrative also has deeply psychological features that seem to point towards universals. And this is a very old theory that persists, and it persists for a reason. There's something to this. First is the fact that it seems to be a universal component of the human experience that people narrate things. They create stories and they transmit stories. So we know from all manner of anthropological research and data that it seems to be the case that this is a universal trait of us as human beings. In the 1960s and 70s, this became a popular method of exploring storytelling, and primarily myth. And one of the things to come out of that is what's called the mono myth. This is also called the hero's tale. And you can read more about that by looking at anything that has ever been written about Star Wars. The first Star Wars famously used Joseph Campbell's early writings about the monomyth and the hero's tale to craft that narrative. George Lucas sat down with the book and sat down with his script, and he mapped his script onto that to make it more mythical. Not anything that he pretends like he didn't do. I think there's a video on YouTube of him talking to Joseph Campbell about the hero's tale. So another thing, though, is sublimination, which is a Freudian idea. And then there are also there's also the reality that narratives play into power dynamics. So this is generally class dynamics. Heroes are more often than not the people that are at the top of the social ladder. And the people who are at the bottom of the social ladder are oftentimes represented as morally less good. So those are also sort of built in psychologically and then play out into a sociological realm. So let me slide it forward here if I can figure out how to move forward. There we go. So let's start with Freud. And I'm not giving you a full rundown of all of Freud. Very superficial. So, but these things you will read more about as you are reading Laura Mulvey, especially. I think Robin Wood brings in a bit. Daniel Dayan mentioned some of this, and Linda Williams will mention it, and I think Modleski will mention it. So a number of your readings are going to touch on some of these ideas. So one component of the Freudian view of perceiving or watching something is that it is a type of sublimation. And sublimation really means a redirection. And for Freud, everything comes down to how we redirect our sexual drive, what's called the sex drive, which is connected obviously to reproduction. But Freud is the psychologist who famously or infamously points out that a lot of what we do, most of what we do, doesn't have to do with reproduction. But from Freud's point of view, much of what we do is actually a redirection of these primary evolved drives that are connected to the need to reproduce. So in other words, that are connected to sex. And sex itself and the sexual desire and sex acts and things like that get sublimated in a way to sort of craft this idea about sex and sexuality that is extraneous to the actual process of reproduction. So how does perception fit into that? Well, many of the scholars who link these two will say that perception is the desire to sit down and watch a movie is a part of the redirection of the sex drive. And so it involves, therefore, some of the components of the sex drive. And I think you probably can easily understand that filmmakers use that, obviously, as a way of making us attracted to the narrative, but not overwhelmed in our attraction to the narrative. We can speak more about that maybe, or if you're in the online class, I don't guess we will be necessarily speaking about it, but you can explore that a bit more in some of the readings. The castration anxiety, it is Laura Mulvey who writes quite a bit about this in her article that you're going to read, a very, very important article in film studies. The castration anxiety is connected to the idea that power in our society is patriarchal. Now, she is using this to talk a lot about classical Hollywood. Daniel Dayan is also talking about classical Hollywood. Robin Wood will also be talking about classical Hollywood. Pretty much anybody that you're going to be reading here who's critical is going to be critical of the classical mainstream narrative. And so castration anxiety fits into this for Laura Mulvey because from her point of view, the classical narrative is a shoring up of the patriarchal structure of society. So the concept of male dominance in society. In Freud, every single male has inside of him an anxiety that Freud will call the castration anxiety. This anxiety is connected to the fear of losing power in society because power is connected to the phallus and castration is the loss of the phallus. So from Freud, the fear of the loss of the phallus is almost equivalent to the fear of the loss of power in society because they are deeply connected to each other. The way Freud comes to this is he says that every single boy feels as though at some stage of their childhood that they are identical to the girl until they begin to be treated differently. And once that happens, normally, and certainly in 19th century European society and early 20th century European society, they are treated better. They're treated more special. They are the young prince. They're the one that is going to inherit the family name and all of that. So the young boy's mind starts to figure out, well, why is this the case? And the only clear distinction that they can see between themselves and the young girl is the fact that the boy has a penis and the girl does not. And so in all other ways, from the boy's point of view, in Freud's analysis, they are identical. But that's the clearest distinction. So therefore, that must be what sets him apart, and that must be what makes him special and gives him certain power. The loss of the penis then becomes connected to, or the fear of the loss of the penis becomes connected to the fear of loss of power, and it's circular, I should say. Not everyone, most people, most men don't have this manifest in any way. It sits inside of the subconscious, the unconscious, in a non-threatening way. It will begin to rise up as a generalizable anxiety, something that the young man or the older man or whoever it may be doesn't understand, but an anxiety that's associated somehow with them losing power in society. What Laura Mulvey will do, and I'll put up a video more specifically about Mulvey later, what Mulvey will do is to integrate the mother into this, which Freud does as well, but highlights the presence of the mother in this educational process. She is somehow related to creating this symbolic dynamic. She is, of course, subject to the power of the husband, certainly in 19th century and early 20th century society. And so the young man who is most deeply connected to his mother sees that his mother is a type of a failure or a less powerful person. And it creates this, it reinforces this idea of castration that Laura Mulvey will play out more in more depth and explain how that connects to the representation of women in classical Hollywood film. For Freud, we have to remember that we are evolved and that our brains are basically animal with some reasonableness added to it. Lots of reasonableness, I should say. So there's like a deep core from Freud's point of view inside of our mind that is basically like an animal. And that is the part that creates the quote unquote inscrutable drives. So we have inscrutable drives inside of us that push us to eat and copulate, but we are more complicated than those simple drives. We as human beings don't just eat and copulate. We have a whole range of things that we do that are not in any way directly connected to that. But we have evolved to do that. And so Freud's basic question is, why do we have all these other things? If we've evolved to do, to eat and copulate, to preserve ourselves as an individual and to preserve the species, why do we go about doing anything else? And so Freud points out that one of the reasons is that we have to sublimate, we have to redirect those things in order to live in a civilization. And so civilization, with its rules and regulations and its patriarchal structure, is something that drives us to redirect what it is that are our two kind of core evolved principles. And that's all part of evolution, of course, from Freud. These are evolved things. This sublimation is an evolved state. It's not wrong. It can lead, in Freud, to bad outcomes, but it fundamentally is not innately wrong. Because what we get out of this is play, work, in Freud. I'm not saying this is true. I'm saying this is what Freud says. We get play, work, and any pleasure that is not directly connected to sex, from Freud's point of view, is all developed through this process of sublimation. So that's a little bit, that's about as far as we need to go with that. Dream analysis is really important in Freud. One of his most important, well-read and earlier books is an entire, very long book about how to analyze dreams and to get meaning out of them. Movies are a lot like dreams. And so it creates this kind of natural connection between Freud's ideas and movie making. So now let's move on to someone who's slightly different, and that is Lacan, or Lacan. He's a Frenchman. He's a student of Freud. But what he does is he separates, like Freud does. Freud separates the mind, what he calls the mind, into several different like components. So you may know the ego, the superego, and the id are like three of those components that Freud sees are part of the mind. Lacan doesn't say that those don't exist, but he creates another type of separation, and those are called, and this separation, I should say, is more about how we connect to the world around us than it is about just what is innate inside of us. So these are both exterior and interior type of concepts of what is called the psyche or the mind. First of all, there's the real, then the symbolic, and then the imaginary. I've got these on slides here. So first of all, the real, and this is going to be mentioned, the real, I think, slightly mentioned by Daniel Dayan. Dayan is going to talk about the symbolic and the imaginary, and I'll get to those two in a minute. So first of all, the real is the real. It's the real stuff that is really existing, really out there in the real world. It's nature, but it's not nature as we think about it. It's not nature as a concept, like the woods or the bear in the woods, because those are culture concepts. So the separation between the real and culture, one of the best ways of thinking about this is to think about the nature show and to think about the act of preserving animals and preserving nature. Most of us have no desire. Well, let me start with the positive first. Most of us have some sort of animal out there in the world that we would like to see preserved. Maybe it's the baby seal, or maybe it's the otter, or maybe it's the eagle, or name your glorious, normally very beautiful animal. And it's probably got someone who definitely wants to preserve it. Even less attractive animals, people may want to preserve. But let me give you a sliding scale. So the polar bear, very majestic, powerful creature. The grizzly bear, very majestic, powerful creature. The lion, those are things people generally, those who don't have to live around them, want to see preserved. Elephants, all of that, lovely nature that we see on the television all the time. But you probably don't see the possum, the American possum, which is an ugly thing, on the TV all the time. And so you may have no interest in preserving it. It may not fit up there. You may run them over on the road and say, just another possum. But I bet pretty much no one who watches this will want to preserve mosquitoes and wasps and hornets and whatever sort of small animal or insect or creature that does harm to you. You probably would like to see them all eradicated. What is happening there is that we are converting the real, actual thing that's out there, that is nature, into something that's culture that we can think about and we can grasp and we can put into certain sort of relationships. That involves sometimes anthropomorphication, so turning the animal into something that seems like a human, so that we think that the bear likes us, or we think the bear hates us, or that we think that the bear is, just wants to be a friend of ours, or things like that. But it also comes down to violence. So we think that the bear wants to kill human beings, or we think that the shark wants to eat or attack humans because it's got some sort of violent nature to it. When in reality, this is all just part of a kind of an evolved system of things that happen. And there is no symbol to them. There is no narrative to them. They just are there. That's what the real is. So all the world is known to us through mediation. And the world as it is known to us through mediation, is not the real. So we can't, in Lacan, we cannot really know the real. It is simply unknowable. It is, in Lacan, a place of pure need. And so it's a little bit like the id. And so there is a parallel to us inside of us, Lacan would say. It's like the need stuff that we feel is connected to the real stuff that's out there. After all, if we need to eat because that's what keeps us alive. But generally speaking, we don't think of food that way. We don't think about, I'm glad I have this steak or whatever because it's keeping me alive. We eat out of a different set of sort of relationships with the food that we have. Now, I think most of us probably have not lived in a world where we did desperately need to eat something maybe we didn't want to eat because we did need to eat to keep ourselves alive. I hope you have not had that experience. But of course, in that state, from Lacan's point of view, you are closer to the real state of reality, the real pure need idea. Fundamentally, as the sort of fourth bullet point says, we are cut off from all of this real state of nature because we have language. And once we turn something into language, we're no longer connected to the real in Lacan. It is impossible. The real is impossible. We cannot speak it because it evaporates in language. It is language itself is a different order that separates off from the real. It doesn't have a connection to it. At the end of the day, it is, however, our material existence, our mechanistic biology, our heart beating, our intestines doing what they do, all of that, for Lacan, is the real. And of course, it's not something that we have generally speaking, we have much control over. It is like our body has a mechanicalness to it that we are separated from. And Lacan would say that mechanicalness that we are separated from, that's the real. Now, that's not too terribly important, really, to Daniel Dayan, but it gives you some framing here. The symbolic is very important to Daniel Dayan. Quite simply, the symbolic order is language. This can be oral, like you are speaking, / oral, like you are hearing, or it can be visual language. Now, I don't know any sign language, so I can't give you an example of that type of visual language, but movie making is a type of visual language, as Daniel Dayan is going to talk quite a bit about. It is a message delivery system, and the language is a message, or messages are formulated in a language structure. So it is not language as in just words that you enunciate. It is language in the very process of you having a collection of sounds in your brain somewhere that convert into something that other people can then interpret and understand. Thoughts, feelings are also part of the symbolic order. Obviously, this is the order of narrative. It is also the order, when it comes to Lacan, it is the order of law and traditions and ideology. So when it comes to law, this part or this sort of aspect of the symbolic is called the name of the Father by Lacan to reinforce the idea that we accept the Father's restrictions on us and our language, not our literal Father necessarily, but the fact that our Father becomes a symbol. Again, that's the symbolic part, becomes a symbol of the patriarchal order itself. And so we obey the patriarchal order because we obey our Father, and all of the restrictions, etc. Now, we know that that's not really the case. We don't really obey all of our Father's restrictions. We don't really obey all the laws. Last time I saw someone driving 70 miles an hour on the interstate, I think everybody was very angry at that person. So there are laws that we definitely do not adhere to, I guess we could say. But it's not the individual law in Lacan. It's the idea of there being a law at all that you adhere to. So it's society, it's like I have here too, traditions, it's ideologies that we don't think about. All of those are part of this name of the Father concept, this part of this patriarchal order in Lacan. As he says, language is the pact which links subjects together in one action. Language is the pact which links subjects together in one action. It is that one action doesn't necessarily have to be as unified as it makes it seem in this sentence. It is the action of actually living in a civilization. Language links us together to be able to do that intersubjectively, I should say. The symbolic is all about desire and our desires, but being linked to how we express them, how we talk about them, how we think about them, how we understand them. And this is where we connect to Freud. Freud also says that we have a desire that we need to convert into language. And that process of conversion into language is never straightforward and always leads to miscommunication or breakages. In Lacan, it's the very similar idea that we have to convert these desires into the symbolic in order for them to have any meaning to us. But that process means that there's contortion that happens. We don't know that the desire is exactly communicated because the desire itself persists. Desire as an abstraction doesn't go away. Even though we convert all of this stuff continually into language. So finally, there is the imaginary. And this is the second component of Daniel Dayan that is very, very important. The imaginary corresponds to the mirror stage. And it doesn't begin and end with the mirror stage. I guess it kind of begins with the mirror stage, but it doesn't end. The mirror stage, so let me finish reading that though. The imaginary corresponds to the mirror stage and marks the transition from the order of need, which is the real, into the order of demand, which is more the symbolic. So what this means is that Freud and Lacan both think of real babies, and they think of real babies transitioning into language. And outside of the mystical quality that children have to be able to learn language, which I'm sure all of us wish we still had, there are developmental changes that happen. And these early psychologists, Lacan's not very early, he's doing this in the 1960s, they are fascinated by how are those changes reflected in what they call the psyche or the mind. So first of all, what is the mirror stage? The mirror stage is an actual stage in babies' development. At some point, and there is a video of this little experiment, like representation of this experiment floating around on YouTube. I'm sure there are a number of them. At some point, a baby, if you put a little smudge on their forehead and you put them in front of a mirror, they will try to wipe away the smudge on the forehead of the other baby, the baby that's in the mirror, because they don't understand the baby in the mirror is themselves. And from Lacan, what he suggests is they don't understand that they have a self that is like bound and sort of encapsulated in a body or in a brain and a mind or whatever. And so he carries this forward to say, well, they don't really understand they have a self in the psychological sense. They have nothing where they say, I want, because the baby doesn't have language. So they can't say, I want. even those babies who know little bits of sign language to sort of communicate what they want, they don't say, I want. They just give the sign for the thing that that it seems that they want. And that would satisfy Lacan, because he would say that they don't know the I in that whole formulation. The next stage in this is that the baby, if you put the smudge on the forehead, the baby, and this is right around 11 months, the baby will look at the mirror, and they may try to wipe away the smudge on the forehead of the baby in the mirror, but then quickly they will understand, oh no, that's me. And so they therefore have an idea of me inside of their psychic development. So the formation of the ego is what is happening here in Lacan. And this demands satisfaction of desire. So now the baby has a way of saying, I want. Maybe not in an actual language, because they may not be at that stage yet, but they know that there is a subject that needs something. And they are composing this symbolic set of relationships. So the imaginary is then associated with the foundations of our ego, the I inside of us, the part of us that says, I want, I speak, I do this. The child creates a fantasy self in the mirror stage, seeing itself as whole and complete in the mirror, the object of the subject by the subject, the objectification of the subject by the subject. In this stage, what he is saying is that when the baby sees the self, the mirror, and thinks, I'm that thing, and the baby doesn't have to have an actual mirror. Lacan talks about this in relationship to the interaction with people around the baby, who are basically like little mirrors. When the mother's eyes turn towards the baby recognizes, I am a creature that the mother is looking at. When the father does that, when the siblings do that, all of that reinforces this idea that I am a creature that these people look at, or that I see in the mirror. From Lacan's point of view, this process means that the baby develops a completeness, a fictional completeness, that will then haunt every single person from here until they die. And that is the desire of wholeness and completion. A desire to correspond to the image in the mirror defines the ego. So the desire for wholeness is what desire is all about in Lacan's setup here. In the symbolic stage, all desires are aspects, from his point of view, of a full desire for a wholeness and completion to stop all desire. At the end of the day, desire really wants to end itself, which can never happen. But it, from Lacan's point of view, defines how the ego sees itself as always sort of lacking something. So these two registers, or levels, or whatever Lacan calls them, I can't remember, the imaginary and the symbolic, are working together inside of our mind to create a sense of what is real for us out there. The really real is objective need, and we have no access to that now. We only have access to how we envision the real out there in the world, in this tension between the imaginary, which is the ego area that also involves imagining things. So it is part of this, the imaginary is where the imagination kind of exists, and the symbolic. And the symbolic is how the imaginary kind of formulates things into concrete symbols and stuff. But they kind of work together to give us a sense of what the real world is out there. So that is a really superficial, really quick introduction to two major characters in the study of psychology, and that are very important for reading Daniel Dayan. I'm working on putting together a little video lecture on Daniel Dayan, which I'll try to get up this weekend, that that'll give you some explanation for what's going on inside the actual text, which hopefully will help you in the reading of that. It's taking me a little bit longer because there's a lot of sentences, and I don't know if I want to put them all into a slide or just point you in the right direction. And so I hopefully will get that up pretty soon. Thank you very much for watching this. I hope it's been helpful, and I will see you on the other side. Ciao, everyone. It's going to take me a minute to stop the recording here.